Iran, a country with some of the world's largest reserves of gas and oil. Its unique strategic position connects the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southern Europe. With vast natural resources, an ancient culture, and a prime location, Iran could easily be one of the wealthiest nations on earth. Just look at Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. All of these countries are thriving thanks to their oil reserve. Their skyscrapers soar ever higher, and their economies are booming. But why hasn't Iran with similar resources reached the same heights? Why isn't oil saving this country while its economy continues to suffer from crises, sanctions, and corruption? Before 1979, Iran was one of the fastest growing countries in the region. The economy was booming, largely thanks to oil exports, which brought billions of dollars into the state budget. In the 1960s and 1970s, Iran launched a series of reforms known as the White Revolution, aimed at modernizing the economy, agriculture, and social sectors. This included investments in industry, education, and healthcare. With high oil revenues, Iran rapidly developed its infrastructure, building new factories, schools, and universities. Western companies and technology flowed into every sector, from oil extraction to consumer goods manufacturing. The standard of living in cities was rising, and Iran became a leading player in the Middle East. Iran aimed to become a modern power, strengthening ties with the US and Europe. The country exported oil and in return received technology and investments. At that time, Iran was seen as the West's key ally in the Middle East. But behind this impressive growth was a different reality. The majority of Iran's population at that time lived in rural areas and remained largely uneducated. The reforms and investments hardly reached the rural regions, and modernization primarily affected the cities. People in villages continued to suffer from poverty and lacked access to basic social services. The growing social inequality, dissatisfaction with corruption, and the isolation of rural populations from the benefits of modernization fueled opposition. Led by Ayatollah Khomeini, protests against the Shah gained momentum. Economic inequality, the Shah's pro-Western policies, and the lack of reforms for ordinary people culminated in the Islamic Revolution of 1979, where secular rule was replaced by strict Islamic governance. Sanctions have dealt the most significant blow to Iran's economy. International sanctions, first imposed after the Islamic Revolution and later tightened due to the nuclear program, have nearly isolated Iran from the global market. The country's main source of income, oil, has been severely restricted. Before the sanctions, Iran exported up to 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. But in recent years, this figure has dropped to 300 to 500,000 barrels per day, leading to a sharp decline in government revenues. However, the country has the potential to produce and export over 4 million barrels per day, if not for international restrictions. Without sanctions, Iran could have become one of the world's largest oil exporters, comparable to Saudi Arabia, bringing tens of billions of dollars into the country's budget annually. Iran, with some of the world's largest oil reserves, faces a paradox. Its black gold isn't saving the economy. Unlike other oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, Iran has been unable to capitalize on its energy potential. Many ask, why doesn't Iran switch to Eastern markets? Despite Western sanctions, Iran can still trade with China, India, and other Asian countries. But due to the technological isolation, corruption, and political instability, Iran cannot fully leverage its export potential. Aging oil infrastructure, which requires modernization, remains a significant issue. But there's another reason major Asian players, like China, are hesitant to invest in Iran's economy. Political uncertainty, fears of sanctions, and instability in Iran's internal market make it a risky partner. Even though cheap oil imports may be attractive, long-term investments in Iran's economy are seen as too risky. The situation in Iran is further complicated by internal problems. Corruption and mismanagement mean that much of the state's funds never reach the population. Modernization programs and infrastructure development are frequently delayed or only partially completed, hindering economic progress. Just like during the Shah's time, inequality remains a serious issue. Although Iran was a secular country before the 1979 revolution, wealth was unevenly distributed. Only the ruling elite and those in power enjoyed economic privileges, while the majority of the population, both in rural areas and cities, remain poor. Problems with access to education and healthcare are not confined to rural areas. Cities also have significant populations without access to quality educational and social services. This worsens economic instability and limits people's opportunities to improve their well-being. Women make up about 49% of Iran's population, but their participation in the workforce is limited. Currently, only about 17% of women are employed, which is significantly below the global average. In comparison, around 56% of women are employed in the US, and in European countries, this figure reaches 60 to 70%. Restrictions on women's rights to education and employment result in the loss of a substantial number of qualified workers, weakening the country's economy. Rising inflation, declining incomes, and high youth unemployment have led to ongoing protests. These protests have become a regular feature of life in Iran as people demand change, justice, and better living conditions. Dissatisfaction among the population has been growing each year. One of the most striking examples was the uprising in November 2019, when thousands of people took to the streets after fuel prices suddenly increased by more than 50%. Protests spread to over 100 cities and regions, and around 200,000 people participated in demonstrations across the country. The government responded harshly. The internet was shut down to limit the spread of information, and police and armed forces were deployed to suppress the protests. Within days, the protests were brutally crushed. According to international organizations, around 1,500 people were killed, thousands were arrested, and hundreds were injured. The protests are not only about economic issues, but also social ones. Restrictions on women's rights, rising poverty, youth unemployment, and the lack of freedom of speech have all fueled new waves of discontent. People want change, but the harsh political regime continues to suppress any signs of dissent. The situation is especially hard for the youth. Nearly 30% of young people in the country are unemployed. This is not only due to the economic crisis, but also because of the lack of job opportunities. High unemployment is driven by sanctions, a weak economy, and corruption that stifles private sector growth. Young professionals are leaving the country in search of work, further worsening the country's economic situation. Each year, around 150,000 people leave Iran, many of whom are highly skilled professionals, especially among the youth. For a country with a population of about 85 million, this creates a serious brain drain. Many Iranians emigrate to Europe, North America, and neighboring countries, seeking better economic and social opportunities. If we rewind time, we'll see that Iran has faced a similar turning point before. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution brought a radical shift in the country's political course. Secular society was replaced by strict Islamic rule. People, tired of corruption and social inequality, longed for change. However, the changes the people hoped for did not bring the promised improvements. Instead of progress, Iran plunged into isolation and economic hardship. Many Iranians who participated in the revolution became disillusioned with the country's new leaders. Today, Iran is once again on the brink of change. Tremendous social and economic pressure is pushing people to demand radical transformations. Just like in 1979, the population is calling for a new direction. More and more people are realizing that Iran needs not just economic reforms, but political transformation. Many experts believe that deep reforms, both economic and political, are necessary to restore the country. Only decisive changes can lead Iran out of the crisis and put it back on the path to prosperity. But what will Iran's future look like? Can the country find a new way forward? Or will it face disappointment once again? The question remains unanswered.